So I'm just going to start off by saying a little bit about who I am and how I got into this racket. My name is Marina Rustow, and I teach history and Near Eastern studies at Princeton. I've been there since 2015. And I started out studying the Babylonian Talmud. I was basically a philologist, and I was working on late antique texts. And then, I don't know, I had this like social history conversion where I suddenly wanted to know not like what was the original text of the Babylonian Talmud, which I was trying to find out by working on manuscripts, but rather how did the Babylonian Talmud become such an important text in Judaism? And the answer to that question brought me into the Middle Ages and into the Islamic world. And I started learning Arabic. And then somebody, like, I don't know, I tripped over some published Guineas fragments in a volume in the library, and I never looked back. I was like, this is too cool. I have to keep doing this. At some point, I actually thought I would work on other kinds of documents, but then I realized like there are a lot of very weird skills involved in finding and reading Guineas fragments. So I should probably just stick with that. So that's what I've been doing for, I don't know, 25 years or something like that. Okay, so what I wanted to do now is give an overview, first of all, of what's in the Guineas, what it is, and also what the implications of its existence are for documents and archives in the medieval Middle East. So we often hear that the medieval Middle East was poor in documents, and there's a difference between the is and the was. The was would be documents weren't produced, and the is would be we don't have any left, but maybe they existed. And you do hear both arguments. In fact, there was a very robust documentary culture. It's very well represented today because of the Guineas among Jews, but even among other communities, you can find lots and lots of pockets of archives that once existed and evidence of the existence of archives, even if the archives are no longer intact and all we have is fragments. Okay, so first and foremost, okay, so that's a bit about documents and archives. I actually wanted to start with a quotation from Nietzsche, which I've never done before, just because, I don't know, I found this recently and I thought, why not? So Nietzsche says, philology is that venerable art that requires of its admirers one thing above all else, to go aside, to take time, to become still, become slow, as a goldsmith's art and connoisseurship of the word, which has nothing but fine, cautious work to take care of, and which achieves nothing if it does not achieve it lento. But for exactly this reason, philology is today more necessary than ever. By exactly this means, philology attracts and enchants us most powerfully in the midst of an age of work. That is to say, a precipitateness of unseemly and sweating over haste that wants at once to be over and done with everything, even with every old and new book. Philology itself is never so easily over and done with anything whatsoever. It teaches to read well, which means to read slowly, deeply, backward and forward with care and respect, with reservations, with doors left open, with delicate fingers and eyes. So this was written towards the end of the 19th century, which is in fact when the existence of the Cairo Guineas became known to the scholarly world. But I think it applies today in a very different way because we're in the age of digital humanities, which is what I'll be talking about in the second part of my talk, just to give a sense of how the digital has transformed philology, actually. Okay, so the name Guineas comes from a Hebrew expression, Beit Geniza, which is a storage chamber for worn texts. And if you read anything about the Guineas, what you read is that the reason this particular storage chamber existed is that there is a custom among Jews not to destroy any written text that might have the name of God on it in Hebrew characters. In reality, there was plenty of stuff in the Guineas that not only didn't have the name of God in Hebrew characters, didn't have Hebrew characters. So clearly there was something much more complex going on in terms of the habits of the community that over a period of very many centuries deposited their stuff into the Guineas. And so like what I always say to my undergrads is, if you could do ethnographic field research in 11th and 12th century Cairo and you walked around and asked people like, why do you put stuff into the Guineas chamber, you get a lot of different answers. Okay, so here's the map, and if you look right south of Cairo, you see Fustat. So in fact, we'll zoom in. Cairo, properly so called, was founded in 969 as the palace complex of the Fatimid caliphs. So the Fatimid dynasty arose in central North Africa in 909, and by 969 had marched eastward into Egypt and Syria. And I'll show you like the big picture in a moment. But the main thing to focus on for now is that they built Cairo. So they built a palace complex that they called El Medina El Qahira, the victorious city, which then gradually grew and expanded. And it grew and expanded until it, oh, there's a monumental gate that the Fatimids built about a century into their rule, which still exists today, although this photo is a 19th century photo. So here are the Fatimids in green versus the Abbasids in blue or lavender, however you want to describe that color. And the lighter green and the lighter lavender are tributary states. So people who are rendering their taxes to the Fatimids without actually being directly ruled by them. So have a look at the Mediterranean, keep your eyes trained on it. This is the early 10th century when the Fatimids declare their caliphate. This is the end of the 10th century. You see what happened there? So although in medieval Islamic history, we often focus on the Abbasids as being kind of like, you know, the important main event, and the Fatimids are sort of happening as like a sideshow off stage somewhere. If you were living in the Mediterranean basin from the late 10th century to the late 12th century, the Fatimids were not a sideshow. They were really very much the dominant power that anybody had to contend with. And in fact, they would have imitators around the Mediterranean basin. So when a caliphate was declared in Cordoba by Abdurrahman III in 929, he was very much modeling his caliphate on the Fatimid caliphate. And then even later, they had Christian imitators, the Norman rulers of Sicily, starting in the 1130s, modeled their entire administration after the Fatimids, right down to the look of their documents, which they continued to write, in some cases, in Arabic script. This was something that people, even at the time, were aware of. So the geographer Al-Maqdisi, who himself came from Palestine, though he was of Iranian origin, has a quotation in his geography where he says, Baghdad has been superseded until the day of judgment. Egypt's metropole has now become the greatest glory of the Muslims. So he very much had a sense that things had shifted away from the Abbasid sphere. And certainly that was the case economically and culturally. Okay, so they found Cairo in 969 when they marched into Egypt, but it wasn't like there was nothing there. What you have here in the south is Fustat. And Fustat was the main residential core of the bigger megalopolis that would later become Cairo once Cairo came to englobe Fustat as well. Fustat had actually been around since the Roman period, but it was a kind of garrison. And in fact, in this black circle that you see here is the remains of a Roman tower. When the Muslims conquered Egypt in 640, they immediately set up Fustat as a garrison city, and it grew from there. So what you're seeing on the inset map are churches in yellow, mosques in green, and then in blue, you see this one synagogue. So these are all buildings that are still standing today and are very much worth visiting, every single one of them. So I'm going to focus in on the Ben Ezra Synagogue, which was built between about 1021 and 1045. So it's not a coincidence that the Jews put a lot of money into rebuilding this particular synagogue, the Jews of Fustat, once the Fatimid era had begun, because there was very much a sense that Egypt was sitting at the center of a very big and exciting set of developments. This is the interior of the synagogue. In fact, the synagogue was rebuilt in the late 19th century. So you're not looking at anything medieval. You're looking at some very, very beautiful late 19th century Egyptian craftsmanship. And this is a view from the mezzanine, which is where the women would have stood in prayer, and the men would have been on the main floor. There are some eyewitnesses accounts from the 19th century from which it appears that the new synagogue was built on the footprint of the old one, but there's a lot of unclarity about that period, and I'll be getting back to that question later. If you follow along the mezzanine on the left-hand side to the front wall of the synagogue, so the opposite end from where you would be standing taking this picture, you see a little tiny opening in the wall. So it was that kind of an opening into which the documents that came to fill the Geniza would have been thrown once they had outlasted or outlived their lives as useful written texts. These are actually recent photos. This one and this one are both recent photos of unprocessed Geniza fragments. So while this discovery happened over the course of the 1880s and 1890s, and gradually collectors and local dealers and foreign collectors came in to gradually empty the contents of the Geniza chamber and cart them off to various collections and libraries, there are still little bits and pockets emerging either inside libraries themselves. So this is a picture from the Jewish Theological Seminary, which had some Geniza fragments lying around in boxes for literally decades until finally somebody said, let's get a grant and let's actually conserve these. And in fact, I mean, I can tell just from this is a Fatimid tax receipt. So, you know, it might look like, you know, garbage to some people, but if you get the right, you know, match between a scholar who's interested in something completely insane like Fatimid tax receipts, then, you know, one person's trash is another person's treasure. Okay, so big picture contents of the Geniza. The vast majority of what was in the Geniza was deposited there starting when the synagogue was built in the 1020s until about 1250. And the reason you have a kind of precipitous cutoff point is simply has to do with the demographics of Cairo, that once that area between the Fatimid Palatine city and Fustat began to kind of fill in, a lot of the population moved northward. And so this wasn't a very active synagogue after 1250, but it did have a resurgence. So there's significant material from the Ottoman period, actually a little bit before the Ottoman period, I would say from right around the time of the Spanish expulsion in 1492. And this is a very, very new and fascinating area of research. It used to be that there was one person working on the Ottoman Geniza, Dotan Arad, who works in Israel, and now there are like 5, mostly because every time I meet somebody who's interested, and I'm like, please do this because it really needs a lot of attention. And the languages are just, you know, like there's an explosion of different languages in Egypt in general and in the Geniza as a reflection of that after 1492. So the languages that you see in Geniza fragments, most commonly, you're going to be looking at Hebrew script. And within Hebrew script, you're looking mostly at Hebrew and Arabic and a little bit of Aramaic. But once you get into the Ottoman period, things really go off the rails. And then you get Catalan, you get Italian, both in Hebrew script and in Latin script. There's even some Judeo-Latin, so Latin and Hebrew characters, unidentified Romance languages. There is some Judeo-Persian, there's Ottoman Turkish, and then there's all kinds of other interesting languages like Coptic and Ge'ez, although not very much. There's a fragment in Devanagari script, which may be a dialect of Gujarati, but like the South Asian linguists that I've shown it to are not completely sure how to identify it. So that really gives you a sense that you're dealing not just with a very international community, but also with a kind of hub. So people are coming to Egypt from quite literally all over the world. The grand total of what was eventually pulled out of the Geniza chamber was about 400,000 pages or fragments of pages, which is like a totally overwhelming amount of material, which is why like a lot of it still hasn't been cataloged. But what does that exactly mean? So 90% of that 400,000 come from what I'm putting in giant quotation marks, books. So what is a book, or what historians would call a literary source? It's simply a text that's meant for posterity, something that was meant to circulate. Now, the form in which we have it in the Geniza isn't necessarily a form that was meant to circulate, because it could be that you copied a text for your own purposes and you didn't necessarily mean, you know, for it to get around. But then you also have the nice scribal manuscripts that people are actually paid to copy and circulate. So the vast majority of what you have is literary. So rabbinic literature, tons and tons of medicine and other sciences, mathematics, philosophy, all of the various intellectual pursuits that make studying the Islamic world so exciting, because you really are in the midst of, just an unbelievable, sort of like renaissance of all of this knowledge. And that's very much reflected in these texts, including well-known Arabic texts that you find copied into Hebrew characters in the Guineas. So for example, the Rasa'il Ikhwan Safa, the letters of the Brethren of Purity, this amazing, probably Ismaili text from the 10th century. You have some copies of that in Hebrew characters. I mean, pretty much any like famous text you can name from that period, you could find in the Guineas in Hebrew characters, and sometimes also in Arabic characters, which is also true of the Ikhwan Safa. However, so I'm going to show you, okay, why do I put books in quotation marks? Not just because they're informally and formally copied books, but also because the medieval book could be many different things. So this is a fragment of a Hebrew biblical codex. I'm saying it's a Masoretic codex because it contains these glosses or commentaries in tiny letters about the pronunciation of the text. And you can tell immediately, even knowing nothing about medieval books, that this comes from a codex. So what's a codex? A codex is the book as we know it. Like here's a nice example of a codex. Just got this one in the mail. You've seen them before, I'm sure, and possibly even held one in your hands. But it wasn't the only form of the medieval book. These are bifolios, so a piece of paper folded in half in this case, that belong to a codex copy of Ecclesiasticus, which is a book that never made it into the canon of the Hebrew Bible, which is fascinating because in the 10th century, Jews were still copying and reading it, even though it was non-canonical literature. And I once asked a colleague, I said, why do you think there are copies of Ecclesiasticus in the Guineas? And she looked at me and she said, because people didn't have TV. I was like, oh, okay. I guess people need interesting things to read. So these are 3 pages that ultimately came from the same codex, which has now actually been reconstructed on the basis of a number of fragments that were identified in the Guineas, which is like totally fascinating that people can do this. I am not one of them. Here's another example of not actually a codex, but what I'm going to call a quire, so in Arabic, kurrasa, which is, and basically this thing is only 10 pages long, and that is much, much more typical of the kinds of books that you find from the Guineas. Short texts that would have circulated in pamphlet form. In this case, this is an autographed manuscript of a Karaite Jewish government official who worked for the Seljuks in late 11th century Palestine, and Luke Yarbrough is leading a team to decipher this thing. It takes a team because this is some very, very brutal Arabic script with absolutely no dots. Why would you put dots? You're insulting the reader. Where you can see that the author was writing possibly in haste and never wanted to lift the pen. So that's another very typical form of the book that you find in the Guineas, the pamphlet. Here's another example of a very cute, tiny codex, some liturgical poetry. And okay, so here's a totally different kind of book. This is a horizontal scroll in which the text is written parallel to the long side in columns. And again, you can tell immediately by looking at it that this is where it came from, because that column, that multi-column layout is absolutely typical of scrolls, and scrolls in particular that are used for liturgical purposes in synagogues. That's a much older form of the book that would have been very common in antiquity until the Codex eventually supplanted it for almost all uses except for ceremonial ones. So this is a different kind of roll book or scroll. It's technically called a rotulus because the text is written parallel to the short side of the page. And this was another way that people copied literary works, but generally only for their own kind of private purposes. So if you were a cantor in a synagogue and you had to recite liturgical poetry, preferably different liturgical poetry every week, because the fans need to be satisfied, some of which you would compose and some of which you would copy from others, you would write your private notes onto something that looked like this and bring it into the synagogue with you. That's what it looks like up close. So couple of meters long, lots of text. Okay, so those are some of the books or book forms that you would find in the Guineas. So what's the rest of the stuff? The rest of the stuff, the other 10% are documents. And that's actually what I spend my time thinking about. So my current estimate is 40,000 documents. I have 30,000 confirmed, but I know that I'm nowhere near getting to the bottom of it, and neither is anyone else that I work with. And so I'm just kind of I'm just assuming we're at about 75%, but who knows? So, check back with us in 20 years. Here's an example of a document. This is a Jewish marriage contract written in Jerusalem in 1028, written in this case in Hebrew and not in Aramaic. Normally it would be written in Aramaic, but certain Jewish marriage contracts, specifically those of the Karaites, which were this other stream of Judaism, got written in Hebrew. Even without knowing anything about Hebrew or anything about anything, you can look at this and you can tell that it could be a legal document because you see signatures at the bottom. And in fact, this has 10 signatures, even though only 2 were legally necessary for the purpose. Weddings were celebratory occasions and you didn't want to offend anybody, so you would bring lots of people to come and sign your marriage contract. I did the same thing when I got married, and it was good fun. And then much more, I would say, like an exciting, immediately legible kind of document for historians are letters. There are tons and tons of personal letters from the Guineas, the vast majority of which are in Judeo-Arabic. Every once in a while you find a letter in Hebrew, but that's because the person who was writing it was like really trying to be impressive. But if you were just writing a normal letter, you would write it in Judeo-Arabic. This is a letter from a trader in Dahlak, which is an archipelago in the southern Red Sea. And he's originally from Libya, and he's on his way to India. Certainly, we know he's on his way to Aden in Yemen, but the main reason that people went to Aden in this period was to go to India and trade in goods that they would retrieve in India. And it's actually quite a hilarious letter because he's complaining to his brother-in-law about the journey. He's a Mediterranean man, so he's used to traveling on boats with nails. However, when he gets somewhere along the Red Sea, he explains to his brother, we had to change to a boat that contained not a single nail of iron. May God protect me with his shield. So he's basically terrified because he's on a boat that's of a more typical Indian Ocean construction that's tied together with coconut coir rope, which is like perfectly stable and sturdy and like not a problem. But he didn't know that because he wasn't used to it. Good stuff like that. These letters are full of gossip. And if you want like a taste of this kind of thing, you can follow the Guineas Lab's Twitter account. So it's Guineas Lab on Twitter. And the person who tweets is Alan Elbaum, who is quite extraordinary. He's amazing at kind of rendering these little anecdotes into 260 characters or less. So the world that is represented is what I'm showing you in the highlighted part of the map. In Jewish history, we basically rarely go east of Iran because somehow if there aren't famous rabbis, like what, Jews don't exist. But actually, when you look into Guineas documents, you see that there were Jews even in Southeast Asia in the 12th and 13th centuries, which, I mean, until I actually saw it with my own eyes, I would never, ever have expected. So this is like a vast, vast world and a very cosmopolitan community that's represented in the Guineas. Okay, so where are these fragments today? They're spread across 60, somewhere between 60 and 70, depending on how you count, collections, generally held in libraries, although there are still some private collections. And why that is a totally fascinating story that I'm not going to tell you because it's a very long one, but I will tell you where you can go to find out more. So the way the numbers look is this, about 120,000 shelf marks, which is the equivalent of about 200,000 fragments, are currently at the Cambridge University Library. So Cambridge is Guineas Central. They have a whole unit of the Cambridge University Library dedicated just to the Guineas. It's called the Guineas Research Unit. It's a fantastic place. I love going to work there. A week there is equivalent of like 3 months in diaspora. Like you learn so much. They take tea breaks where you get ideas that you never possibly could have gotten elsewhere. Super fun place. So they're Guineas Central, and they're also really on the forefront of cataloging and digitization. They're an absolute model of custodianship. The second biggest collection is the Jewish Theological Seminary, right up the street from where I live. And it's an absolutely amazing collection in which very important discoveries are being made all the time because it's kind of an under-researched collection. So that's like, you know, the Fatimid tax receipt in a box that I showed earlier is from the Jewish Theological Seminary. Third biggest collection is at the National Library of Russia in St. Petersburg, but that doesn't come from the Venezue Guineas, or at least not most of it. Most of it comes from the Karaite Guineas. So certainly related material, but not exactly the same. And then you have lots of smaller collections scattered around the place. So if you want to know why the collections are so scattered, there are two books you can read. The first one is Sacred Trash by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole, which tells the story of the scholarly discovery of the Guineas in a wonderfully readable fashion. I mean, you can take this book to the beach. It's like just great fun to read. That was published in 2011. And then a book that, if it's not out already, should be out in a couple of months, by Rebecca Jefferson, The Cairo Guineas and the Age of Discovery in Egypt, where she goes back to some of the murkier episodes of what was exactly going on in the Ezra Synagogue in the 1880s and the 1890s when people started to get wind of these finds. And she goes into the archives of various libraries, and apparently there are quite a few mysteries that get revealed in this book, which I have not yet read, but I'm really looking forward to it. Okay, so I've given you a sense of the languages that you find in the Guineas, the types of texts, so literary on the one hand, documentary on the other. I've talked to you about the collections, and I've just given you a little bit of a glimpse of the contents. That's already 4 different vectors along which you can try and encompass the Guineas in, let's say, a spreadsheet if you were building one, or a database if you were building one for other people. So at this point, I want to kind of segue into the world of the digital Guineas and talk about some of the challenges that my team and I have personally faced in trying to maintain one of the oldest existing databases of the Guineas, and also some of the new and exciting ventures that are being done in digital Guineas world. So I'm showing you right now the brand spanking new, we just launched this in May, back end. So this is like the private part that you're not going to be able to see because you don't work at the Guineas lab, of the Princeton Guineas project. This is the database that I run. I inherited it when I came to Princeton in 2015. It was founded by my predecessors, Mark Cohen and Abram Yudovich, in the 1980s. So absolute visionaries, because they were convinced, and they were of course completely correct, that one of the best ways to study such a scattered and complex cache of documents was through digitization. Whatever that meant in the 1980s, it means something very different now. So in structuring the database, we had to ask ourselves some of the same questions that I just answered for you, but in a more structured way. So what we have is the language of the document. We have the type. So not just documentary or literary, but within documents, we divide them into letters, legal documents, lists or tables, that's one category, and accounts, which is like its own totally complex world. Which collection it belongs to. A description of the contents, which we have both as like a verbal description that you can read. These are kind of fun to read through. There's a front end, by the way, where you can see all the same information. It's just laid out differently. And then we also are trying to figure out what to do with tagging, because tagging is a nice way of enhancing discoverability, but it's also complex because tags are only as good as you make them. So you have to spend a lot of time tagging things if you want to use that as a system. And then, of course, crucial for any database, you have your unique identifier and other database specific information, like, for example, when the record was last modified and other stuff like that. And these are the filters on the side, on the right hand, where you can filter things by all kinds of different parameters. So that's just to give you a glimpse of, like, when I'm actually sitting working on Guineas fragments, a lot of what I'm doing is staring at something that looks like this. So very unromantic. Okay, so that's a glimpse. So here's the overview of the digital Guineas. There are lots of digital Guineas projects. I want to just talk about 3 as kind of the big, names that you sort of need to know if you want to get interested in this material. So the Princeton Guineas project, which I just mentioned, the Friedberg Guineas project, which, they're great friends and partners of ours, but they're different. They do something different from us. There's a little bit of overlap, not completely. And then the Cambridge University Digital Library, which comes out of the Guineas Research Unit that I mentioned earlier. So what do each of these things do? They all do something a little bit different. The Princeton Guineas project was founded in 1985 by Mark Cohen and Avram Yudovich, specifically in order to encompass the documentary Guineas. So at the time, everybody believed that there were maybe 10,000, maybe 15,000 Guineas documents. And the idea was to have transcriptions of all of them in this database so that they could be word searchable. So that is the Princeton Guineas project and why it was founded. The Friedberg Guineas project came along much later, and those 20 years make a massive difference, because by 2004, what we had was much, much less expensive digital imaging. So the Friedberg Guineas project, first and foremost, wanted to make images of the entire Guineas, so all 400,000 fragments, available to anybody online. And in fact, they succeeded in doing that. So what does that mean? Actually, it's a lot of diplomacy. It means that Jakob Schweka, of blessed memory, a Cairene Jew who was one of the big names in computational linguistics, went around on airplanes to all kinds of libraries, and in his charming English or French or Arabic or Hebrew or whatever he was speaking to people, convinced them to let the FGP pay for their photographers to photograph their Guineas fragments, or bring the FGP's photographers in to do it themselves. And that, a lot of the back end of these amazingly shiny new digital projects, it's just good old fashioned pavement pounding. And in fact, that's what FGP was built on. They did a lot of other stuff too, but I'll talk about that in a second. The Cambridge University Digital Library was founded a little bit later, and they have a totally different approach to digitization from FGP. They are using the IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework, which is kind of the cutting edge for displaying images online. And they also devote an enormous amount of time and staff hours into actually describing the documents. Whereas FGP doesn't describe documents, they cull descriptions from other researchers. PGP does describe documents. We have a staff in-house. We do lots of description ourselves. But Cambridge only deals with Cambridge. So Cambridge is dealing with half the Guineas, but the other stuff, they have no reason to do it, right? In other words, library databases can be amazingly sophisticated things, great models for other people, but ultimately they can really only handle their own stuff because that's what their staff is paid to do. Okay, so Princeton Guineas project, documentary texts only, FGP, all Guineas, Cuddle, as it's pronounced, Cambridge only. But what do we actually do with these things when we put them online? So for PGP, what we were founded to do was to put transcriptions online so that you could search the actual content of Guineas fragments. When Eve Krakowski, my colleague, who's also a Guineas specialist at Princeton, and I were hired in 2015, the way we think is like, we want to know the whole before we know the part. So we're like, how many Guineas fragments that are documentary really are there? Let's do this. Let's try to find them all first, and then we'll invest money in transcription. So when we came to the project, there were 4,250 transcriptions. And we said, the problem with transcriptions is, on the one hand, documents are only one page, right? Which is great because, I'm a little bit ADHD, and so I like concentrating on things that are only one page. It also means that if it's really hard to read, don't worry, it'll be over soon. On the other hand, if you can't read 20% of a document, you really feel terrible. You feel like this text is so short, like how can I possibly send this transcription out into the world without reading all the words? So it'll take you 20% of the time to read 80% of the text, and then it'll take you maybe like another 6 months to read that additional 20% of the text. So we thought, rather than like slaving over transcriptions and trying to make them perfect, let's just do a quick and dirty description of everything. And so we shifted gears in 2015, and now what we're mainly involved in is description. FGP did 3 things that were absolutely fantastic. The imaging project, which I told you about. They also did a bibliographic project. So they actually went through issues of journals for the last, like, who knows how many, decades and decades, and how many journals, combing footnotes to figure out any time a Guineas fragment had been referred to. So why is that important? Because let's say you're at Cambridge and you call a binder from the stacks and you're sitting there and you're looking at it and you're like, oh my gosh, I just found the most amazing thing in the world. This is signed by Maimonides, right? There's lots of Maimonides autographs in the Guineas. You're like, wow, a Maimonides autograph. I'm going to be famous. My spouse will love me more. And you don't know actually if somebody's worked on it. So now with FGP, you do. You can go into FGP and be reasonably certain that if there's no bibliography on it in FGP, nobody's worked on it, and indeed you will be famous. Can't guarantee that your spouse will love you more, however. And the other thing that FGP did was it built some amazing algorithms for joining fragments together that once belonged to the same scrap, and I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So they were like on a totally other sort of trajectory from PGP. At PGP, we're historians, so we just want to make the stuff available and usable to people like us who are historians. At FGP, they're computational linguists, they're librarians, they're like very, very computing heavy, so they were able to do things that we could never have possibly dreamed of, and vice versa. And then at Cuddle, so I have like some kind of Zoom. Oh, there we go. I just moved it. And at Cuddle, they're dealing with descriptions, but also library descriptions. So they actually like take measurements and tell you how many lines on the page and stuff like that, which we don't involve ourselves in at FGP at all. So images and descriptions. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the revolution that FGP put into practice with finding joins. Because this is a fragmentary, basically massive pile that was found in this chamber, you can often have fragments of the same sheet of paper and have absolutely no idea, like, that, one could be in Oxford and the other one could be in New York. In this case, they were both in the Cambridge University Library, but nobody knew until somebody actually realized, like, oh, actually, I have a join for this. If you have a great photographic memory, I salute you. It will be much easier for you to find joins. If you don't, then you have the algorithm on FGP. So here's how it works. You take a fragment. I looked at this fragment that was like cited in the literature, and I said, wow, it'd be so nice to find the bottom half. Maybe the bottom half even has a date on it. And so the first time the FGP algorithm was publicized on their website, I said, let me give it a try. This is 2014. I should say also, I had to present at a conference on the Mamluk period, and I don't know that many Mamluk era documents, but I knew this was one, and I said, who knows, maybe I'll find a join. So oh yeah, this is how they were able to do this. There's this whole, if you ever want to read an article in the International Journal of Computer Vision, this is an article that you can read on how they actually managed to build the algorithm that, in a sense, used, I mean, it's almost like, facial recognition software. They sort of mapped the face of the document in order to figure out the density of the text and certain other fingerprints of the scribal hand in order to join fragments together. So, so here's what you do. You plug in your shelf mark, you hit join suggestions, and you see what happens. Now, you will be frustrated because probably 95%, maybe 99% of what it gives you are going to be false positives. False positives aren't useless because it's still like, it's showing me all these Arabic script documents that I didn't know existed, which is kind of nice if you're interested in that sort of thing, as I am. But it turns out, and there are 3 different algorithms, by the way, because who knows, like one might work better, one might work better for certain things. So when I hit the second algorithm, I saw this and got very excited because that turned out to be the missing bottom half of this document, and I was finally able to see it the way its scribe had seen it once upon a time. Unbelievable case of beginner's luck. I've had a lot of frustration since then, but I've also had some amazing finds with the join finder, and social media is filled with these little triumphs of like, the join finder worked for me today. You can find good stuff like that on both Twitter, Facebook, and I think more recently Instagram. Okay, so what I want to do now, just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of the like details of the PGP. Please feel free to ask me about this in the Q&A. And I want to talk a little bit about handwritten text recognition, because that is, I know, both, you know, interesting to those of you who are listening to this, and also it's one of the things that's gotten me very, very excited over the last couple of years. So handwritten text recognition is essentially optical character recognition for handwritten documents. You're using neural networks in order to build a model with which you can do computational paleography, i.e. you don't have to read this, the computer will read it for you. Wouldn't that be amazing? Will paleographers be put out of a job? No, I don't think so, but we can talk about that another time. It's a partnership, right? Just like dishwashers, like sometimes you still have to hand wash and stuff. Likewise with HTR, it's not gonna put us out of a job. So HTR already exists for Hebrew script. And in fact, there are projects that have broken the 90% accuracy barrier for Hebrew manuscripts. But what kind of Hebrew manuscripts? Very scribally written Hebrew manuscripts from a constrained time and place, specifically the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we're talking about manuscripts produced in and around Palestine in a range of like 3 centuries of antiquity by trained scribes. Together with my colleague Daniel Stockelben Ezra at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, we thought it would be interesting to throw something much more complex at the computer and say, well, what happens if you have a wide variety of Hebrew handwriting styles with a lot of crazy layouts? Like, what happens then? Unfortunately for us, we really wanted to know the answer because now we actually have to do the work. So doing the work for HTR, there are 2 basic steps. Step 1, segmentation, where you teach the computer to actually recognize the words on the page and distinguish it from the background or from holes or from other kinds of noise and information that it might be visually picking up. And then the second is where you actually build the model where the computer learns to read, where you're teaching it to read. So in order to do that, you do a kind of rough automatic segmentation where the computer picks up the words against the background, and then human beings have to go in and correct the segmentation. Ditto for the transcription. You do like, actually what you do is you feed the computer a good transcription in order to give it ground truth, right? In order to give it something solid to base itself on. And gradually, once you have a transcription from which you've stripped all of the reconstructions of lacunae and all that stuff that scholars like get rewarded for doing, which is like, I know what this says, even though there's a hole in the page, you got to take that away, because if it's not there and the computer can't see it, you can't put it in your HDR model. So there's a lot of massaging of the transcriptions that happens in the course of teaching the computer. The other thing that has been going on for us, we just started this project in March, is we've discovered how flawed many of the PGP transcriptions are. It's sort of forced us to do a massive editorial review of all of our transcriptions. And we realized things like people had different ways of using brackets because the PGP is such an old project. So 35 years, you get different transcription standards. So it's actually kind of sent us down this rabbit hole of ultimately improving the PGP, but it's going to take us, I think, a couple of years to get through it. So the payoff for this is we have identified somewhere between 10 and 15,000 documentary texts from the Guineas for which there are no transcriptions. And that's what we want to do. Like at the end of 2-3 years of all this hard labor of correcting segmentation, correcting transcription, boom, you press a button and you get 10 to 15,000 new transcriptions. Then we're going to have real problems, because then it's like, well, how are we going to read all this stuff? And then we have to develop maybe ways of dealing with very large bodies of text that don't involve sitting down and spending the rest of your life reading through them. But we'll cross that bridge when and if we come to it. Okay, so the very last thing I want to mention, because this is like just super fun, is the Zooniverse. The Zooniverse is a very large platform for citizen science, where you can go in and look at lots of pictures of pollinators in Irish fields, or baby galaxies being formed, or a certain kind of cell, under a microscope. And it's essentially grunt work. It's scut work that somebody who runs a lab isn't going to want to do, because it's so repetitive, it's so tedious, but you can pretty much teach any interested person to do it. So why not use crowdsourcing? So Zooniverse was looking for a project that involved transcribing texts. They actually have a few now. One is Oxyrhynchus fragments in Greek, which is quite wonderful. And so together with some colleagues, we made a pitch to the Zooniverse for transcribing Guineas fragments using crowdsourcing. Now, you may think, how are you going to do that? So it's complicated, and what we're not actually expecting to get out of this project is like beautiful transcription. That's not why we're in this game. We're in this game for other reasons, which is the Zooniverse has allowed us to build a workflow that plays on people's strengths, which is, can you recognize Hebrew from Arabic? Here's what Hebrew looks like. Here's what Arabic looks like. Divide them into two piles. Can you tell a document from a literary text? Well, if you see bumped corners, it was probably part of a codex. Put that into the literary pile. Then we get some documents that we didn't know about, that kind of thing. Then we actually have a field guide to transcription where we say, you don't need to know how to read Hebrew or Arabic. Just look for these shapes, okay? And then if 10 people say it's the same thing, chances are that's what it is, okay? Because obviously there are some people coming in who actually do know Hebrew and Arabic, so you have a control. We're not going to get piles and piles of new transcriptions. And in fact, working with the data that comes out of the Zooniverse is its own totally complicated problem. But what Zooniverse is getting out of this is some very, very interesting data on, does crowdsourcing work for transcription? So it's a kind of like, you think you're in this for Guineas studies, but actually there's a whole other thing going on at the back end. If you're into Sudoku, crossword puzzles, what have you, I highly recommend going into Zooniverse, picking a project. Please pick our project, and having some fun just going through the workflows and trying your hand at Guineas studies that way. Okay, so that is basically what I wanted to share with you by way of a taste of the digital Guineas. And if you want to know more, you can go to the Guineas Lab website, so guineaslab.princeton.edu, and we have lots of fun materials for beginners, for advanced people, pretty pictures. You can see our team and get a sense of the work that we do day to day. Thanks so much for listening.
Marina, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I trust that anyone who will be watching this in the future online will enjoy it too. This was just really great. I really appreciate you. You're such an engaging speaker. It's really wonderful.
A pleasure.
And if you are watching this on YouTube, my plan is in the future to have more talks kind of along similar lines, the intersection of digital humanities and kind of Islamic studies broadly conceived. So sort of be on the lookout for that. All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop recording now.